coming up.
Since 2021, we've had over 100 Christian churches burned, vandalized, or desecrated in Canada. And sometimes when I see that, and I see the lack of media coverage of those attacks on religious freedom, I think to myself, like, yo, dog, are we like in the Truman Show or something right now?
First of all, thank you for leading the Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association. I've had the pleasure of receiving a few legal briefs, and the legal work was spot on and very, very helpful.
Don't you think that promoting hatred in Canada should be forbidden, even if it's based on a religious text or religious opinion?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
I appreciate the witnesses for being here and for your contributions to this conversation. I certainly think that we are due for an important conversation about religious freedom in our country, and this has been an important part of that discussion. I want to start off by just maybe trying to give a bit of my perspective as a person from the suburbs of Toronto. Since 2021, we've had over 100 Christian churches burned, vandalized, or desecrated in Canada. And sometimes when I see that, and I see the lack of media coverage of those attacks on religious freedom, when I see that we cannot even in the House of Commons get every party to agree on condemning those attacks on religious freedom, I think to myself, like, yo, dog, are we like in the Truman Show or something right now? Like, it just seems so frustrating and puzzling how you get to this point. And often I will hear from constituents who are concerned about it, and they'll say, express a sense of hopelessness. Like, well, how do you get people to care about this? And then I see other communities go through their own ordeals when it comes to attacks on their religious freedom. We've seen, schools and synagogues get shot at in Montreal, or just over the weekend, we've seen the House hate-motivated attack on a Muslim family in London. And I think to myself, well, maybe there's an opportunity for us all to work together and draw attention to the various ways that faith communities in this country may experience discrimination or persecution. Maybe there's an opportunity for us to build some bridges across different religious communities in hopes that the experiences that are happening throughout this country right now, where people feel in many ways afraid that they will lose their jobs by showing that they are a person of faith, or that they will lose something, their standing perhaps in their workplace or their school for showing that they are a person of faith. That perhaps by working together, we actually wind up being able to protect believers of all different types. So I guess maybe I'll pose my question on that to you, Mr. Panju. As you think about, charting a path forward, where do you see the possibility of different faith communities being able to work together and support each other better?
Thank you for that question, MP Giovanni. You're right. There is a sincere division right now in our society amongst various cultures and faiths, and we are optimistic that we can get to a point eventually where this unity is developed. I understand that the purpose of these sessions is to speak about what governments can do, and there are so many things that can be done, and one thing I want to focus on is to speak about how government policies shape perceptions. I won't profess to be an expert in all forms of discrimination, but to the extent that I'm an expert in anything, it is Islamophobia. And I know that Canadians look to our leaders for direction. And the research confirms that when there is hateful rhetoric from the top, whether it's the government in power or other politicians or any other people of influence, other individuals from the community take notice. And there's a corresponding impact at the ground level. And so when governments introduce actions and policies to target particular groups, as I mentioned, that provides a license for other Canadians to discriminate against these same communities. So to the extent that Islamophobia is a recognized issue, and I think largely there's a consensus, but I know that there's some that disagree, I think there needs to be a tangible action and engagement, not just money that's invested in different programs, but a meaningful appetite to hear the perspective from those who are impacted the most. And so to the extent that governments can help to coordinate this, we think that would be a great starting point. So often, right now, Islamophobia, for example, is conflated with anti-Palestinian racism. And they're related but different concepts. Not everyone who is a Muslim is Palestinian, and not everyone who's a Palestinian is a Muslim. And for many Canadians, that's not an apparent issue. And the compounding impacts of anti-Palestinian racism and gendered Islamophobia are serious concepts. And we think the governments need to take an active role to recognize this and also play a role in educating our communities about the values and strengths that make Canadians who we are.
Mr. Perry, just a follow-up question before my time is up. There was a moment of hope, I thought, last summer, where I did start to see different religious communities working together. And the particular issue of concern for many believers was the matter of parental rights and the fact that at different levels of government, we had politicians who were actively campaigning against the rights of mothers and fathers to play a leading role in their children's education. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that as a potential issue for collaboration.
That's a great question. I'm familiar that matters of education fall under the provincial purview, so I'll be mindful of this committee and this head of government's jurisdiction. Muslims are not a monolith, and there's different perspectives even within our community. And so questions like these are important, and to understand how communities feel about these, there needs to be meaningful discussions within our community to get these answers.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Panju, first of all, thank you for leading the Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association. I've had the pleasure of receiving a few legal briefs, and the legal work was spot on and very, very helpful. So thank you for that. Now, in your testimony, you touched on the fact that since October 7th, we've seen some discrimination in the workplace. This is something that many of us have read about in the papers as well. And it truly, truly is chilling that if someone was expressing concern about developments in the Middle East or was of the opinion that human rights was not being respected, that they would be let go from their place of work. Given that it is a very significant issue, and it concerns me to no end, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, please.
So thank you for that important question. And as I mentioned in my introduction, there are serious concerns about members from our community about their employment prospects. And without repeating too much of what I said earlier, there are legitimate concerns that if employees or students or candidates make comments about the conflict, they will face repercussions. This matter was perhaps best exemplified recently with an instance of student protesters who had issued a petition calling for change and expressing their position on the conflict. Numerous students from the Lincoln Alexander School of Law signed a letter of support for Palestine and all forms of Palestinian resistance. And there was extensive backlash from the legal community that targeted the students who signed this letter, many of whom are racialized individuals, including many visibly Muslim women. So students were doxxed on various social media platforms. There was various organizations and commenters who referred to them to be named, expelled, deported, and labeled them as terror apologists. And many students received disturbing and threatening emails, phone calls, and messages that included threats of violence and death, as well as graphic videos and images. This is abhorrent. And following extensive backlash, this extensive backlash that I was talking about, the university engaged a retired Chief Justice McDonald to thoroughly review this letter. And in that letter, the justice found that this letter was not anti-Semitic, and that it was not anti-Semitic to criticize the actions and policies of the Israeli government towards Palestinians or to apply concepts from Islam, international law, like colonialism, genocide, and occupation, and discussions of and statements about the governments of Israel. And that's a direct quote from the Justice's report.
Mr. Andrew, you're talking about prospective work. These were
Yes.
individuals who were trying to get jobs at law firms, but then they were blacklisted. But I've also heard of instances where people who had jobs were let go because they expressed an opinion. What do you know about that? And I have very little time, probably 40 seconds.
Yes, that's correct. This has been happening on a widespread basis, which was accentuated at the time of the conflict. There's a need for proper discussion about what constitutes hate in our communities. And if there are individuals who are actually expressing hateful comments and hateful perspectives, there's a role to deal with those. But right now, there's a lack of understanding and context about what words and actions really mean. And to the extent that all individuals are entitled to due process and fairness and civil rights, there's a need for the government to make this known to all employers to make sure that we live in a society that's reflective of the values that we adhere to.
Thank you, Ali.
Am I allowed to
Just
add
a second,
something?
please. I stopped the time. You have 1 minute, 54 seconds, but I stopped it. Professor McFarlane, I'm sorry. Is there a problem?
No, I just wanted to be able to say something.
Oh, I'm afraid I am guided by the rules of the House. I cannot recognize a witness unless there's a question posed to the witness.
Imam Yusri, I have a question for you. I listened to your speech earlier where you spoke out against hate speech towards Muslim communities in Canada. And you mentioned that this has harmed relationships between people in Canada. And I understand what you were saying, and I'd like to know, in your opinion, do you think all forms of hate speech should be forbidden in Canada, or do you think that we should allow hate speech to have its place in Canada?
Thank you, MP, for the question. I understand that many sessions were heard before with about the anti-Semitism, and I think that we are discussing now issues about Islamophobia, and definitely with no all forms of hate should be addressed and should be banned, and we should all work together to combat all forms of hate against Muslims or other religions and cultures. This goes without saying. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur l'Imam.
At present, there's a provision in the Criminal Code 319 that bans incitement of hate and anti-Semitism. But there is an exception in the code that says that a defense is if a person has expressed an opinion on a religious subject or an opinion based on a religious text that the person believes in. In your opinion, should this exception be eliminated from the criminal code, or should we maintain this exception and this defense and therefore allow fomenting hate if it's based on a religious text?
As I said in my first comment, we should work together to combat all kinds of hate and work together towards this with legislatures and actively. Speaking about this particular law or amendment that you are proposing, I am not aware of its details. However, I would like to say that protecting the freedom of expression and the freedom of people of the faith and all faith groups to practice the religion freely is a fundamental right that we have seen so many attempts to take away from this freedom through different proposals recently. One through the chaplaincy program to remove people of Abrahamic faith from being chaplains in the federal government prisons, and different types of legislations. So I would be. Je vous remercie,
Imam Yusri, mais
Thank you. But since I only have 2 minutes, I'd like to hear your colleagues on the same question. I'd like to ask the question to Ms. Mazar. So it's the same question. In your opinion, should we maintain the exception in the criminal code, or should we forbid hate speech even if it is based on religious text?
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for your question. It's a difficult question to answer as a layperson, and I will probably go towards thinking of competing rights under the human rights legislation, where people have right to practice their religion freely on one hand, and then people or citizens have also rights to live their lives free of harassment, free of any kind of hate and discrimination and things like that. It's really very difficult to say at this point for me whether we keep it or we let it go.
Ok, je vous remercie, madame. Je m'excuse.
Thank you. I don't mean to be rude, but we have very little time. I think we have about a minute left. I'd like to ask the same question to Mr. Panju. I understand that you are a lawyer and also president of the CMLA. And so don't know if you're an expert when it comes to freedom of expression, but in your opinion, should we maintain the religious exception in the criminal code that allows for the defense of promoting hatred if it is based on a religious text, or do you think it should be eliminated?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I know I don't have very much time to answer this question. In fact, I see you have 30 seconds. I'm happy to give more details if this comes around another time. But for now, ultimately, it may be up to the courts to decide whether or not this bill is discriminatory. But fundamentally, our organization rejects the bill's underlying assumption that religions and religious communities are instigating and fomenting hate. I'm not sure what evidence this assumption is based off of, but it sounds a lot like religious and Islamic tropes that have been going on for generations. Our experience is the complete opposite, that these communities instead serve to build inclusion and enable the ability to contribute to our society. And the timing of this bill is concerning, and I'm happy to go into more detail when the question comes around again.
I want to turn to Dr. McFarland, who wanted to intervene earlier, and give her a chance to provide a response if we haven't passed that moment. And then if we have, I have another question for Dr. McFarland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. Just a quick point on the rise in worrying employment conflict since October the 7th. One of the things I want the committee to be aware of, and in this way your work overlaps with the work of the Heritage Committee, is that in these instances where people raise complaints about Islamophobia and prejudice and are terminated because of a remark they made or simply because they're complaining about hostility in the workplace, they are almost without exception required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So you're not going to know about the number or extent of these instances because they're hidden in an NDA.
Thank you for that important information, Dr. McFarland.
If you look at discrimination, violence, whether it's towards the Muslim community or Jewish communities, or any other type of discrimination based on race, color of skin, gender, aren't we at a time where we have to abolish all types of hate? And in that sense, don't you think that promoting hatred in Canada should be forbidden, even if it's based on a religious text or religious opinion?
I think that it's extremely important that we remain very vigilant about hate speech, and I am a big supporter of the need to have hate speech principles to protect people. But I also think that one of the things that we do in our legal system is we exclude any kind of reasoning. It's very interesting that might be based on a religious text. If you see a Muslim woman trying, for example, to enforce her maha, her agreement that she's made under Islamic law for an amount of money to be paid in the event of divorce, the courts won't accept any arguments that are based on references to religious texts. That seems to me to be completely ridiculous. So I don't understand why we would not include reference to religious texts as part of what we want to protect in hate speech.
Merci, Madame McFarlane.
Thank you, Dr. McFarlane. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, for the next 2.5 minutes, please, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. One of the topics that hasn't come up today has been the role of the media, the social media giants, in furthering disinformation and hatred. And I wonder whether, I'll start with Ms. Massar, if there have been any positive experiences in trying to work with the social media companies in stopping that distribution of disinformation and hate.
You, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. MP Garrison. For us, as a regional organization with very little capacity, few staff, and all that, it's beyond our capacity to actually take, these big giants into any kind of account. We have seen a tremendous increase in reporting for online hate, and it's coming from all parts of Canada, you wouldn't believe, from Burnaby to Surrey to everywhere, and people want us to intervene. We're trying to learn ourselves how can we intervene in these cases. They're sending us information this year especially. At this time, I don't have an answer. We don't have the capacity, but of course we look up to the government to do things where there's some accountability for these big giants.
And thank you. And the same question to you, Mr. Panju. What about trying to hold them accountable for promoting hatred?
Thank you for that question. So we're familiar that Bill 63 is currently before the House. It's a complex issue, and I think that there needs to be some more dialogue with our groups on a more directed basis. You're right, equity-seeking groups like ours are often the victims of and the targets of hate speech, but there also needs to be some more consultation to ensure that any such measures do not overly censor legitimate, non-hateful speech from equity-seeking groups as well.